Manzo. So, our first topic, tourism promotion between Latin America and Canada, presented by Gloria Guevara Manzo, is a very important one to all our countries. Gloria, she's the president and CEO of the World Travel and Tourism Council, WTTC, representing the global travel and tourism private sector. Gloria was a Minister of Tourism of Mexico. She was appointed in March 2010 by President Calderon. Among other high responsibilities, she was recognized as one of the most influential women in Mexico by CNN and Expansion. So we're in good hands, no doubt. Gloria, the floor is yours. Gloria, you have to unmute your...
Very good, thank you, now I can. Thank you, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Ambassador. What a pleasure and an honor to be with all of you. And thank you also to Juan Jose Gomez for inviting me to join this session, and our friends also from all over Latin America. I have a quick presentation, and then we'll have some questions to answer any concerns or any doubts about travel and tourism. Liza, can you move to the next slide, please? What is WTTC? Let me give you first a context and a perspective. WTTC, as the ambassador mentioned, is the World Travel and Tourism Council. We represent the global private sector. A little bit over 200 CEOs from around the world. They're our members. 30% of them are in America, 30% in Asia, 30% in Europe, and 10% of the rest of the world. We cover all the industries, from airlines, airports, tour operators, destinations, travel agencies, OTAs, all of them. We have Sergio here with us, who's part of COCHA. COCHA is one of our members, for instance. But as you can see here, these are some of the faces. Currently, my chair is Chris Naceta. He's the CEO of worldwide of Hilton Group. The vice chair for North America, for instance, is Arnold Donald from Carnival Corporation that has 11 cruise lines. And then, of course, for Latin America, we have Alex Osaya from AMA Resorts. Now, this organization was created 30 years for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was to speak with one voice. We are the equivalent of the UNWTO, but for the private sector. The second one is to quantify the economic impact of travel and tourism. So if we move to the next slide, you will see this is our data from last year. We produce numbers, and we measure the impact of travel and tourism in 185 countries from around the world using exactly the same methodology. Oxford Economics help us to move and also to quantify this data. In the chart below, you will see the growth of the economy, and it has been pretty good in the last 9 years, but the green line is the growth of GDP for travel and tourism. So as you will see, for 9 years, we have outpaced the growth of travel and tourism. And of course, last year was not the exception. Travel and tourism worldwide contributed to 10% of the global GDP. And we grew in average 3.5% versus 2.5% of the global economy, which is 40% more. What's interesting also is related with the jobs. 330 million jobs around the world depend on our sector, which is 1 out of 10. But I would say the most important number here, when you look at all the jobs created in all the industries and all the sectors around the world, 1 out of 4 in the last 5 years, 1 out of 4 were in travel and tourism. So by far, this is the sector that creates more jobs globally, and of course provides more opportunities for countries. Now, the sector is pretty big compared to others. Now, we'll move to the next slide. We were able to quantify also the impact of COVID. I have to tell you that at the very beginning, we were talking about 50 million jobs impacted. Then unfortunately, that number grew to 75, then 100. The current scenario, unfortunately, 121 million jobs have been impacted so far globally. This is a devastating amount, because as you can see, a lot of lives have been impacted. And when you look at the impact also on GDP, as you have it here, is 3.5 American trillions, or 3,435 billion so far in loss. Now, the bad news is that if we don't do it right, if we don't coordinate the effort among countries, if we don't coordinate with the private sector, unfortunately, this number can grow. So I really applaud the effort of what you're doing and having these type of events and the coordination that you're making throughout the region and with the roles that you have representing our countries, because the coordination is key. Moving to the next slide, basically, not only we do economic research in terms of quantifying the impact, we also do different types of research. And last November, it was interesting because we produced a report that talks about the different situations that have impacted travel and tourism. So we analyzed 90 different crises in the last almost 20 years. And it was very interesting because they were grouped in 4 different types. Natural disasters, of course, they impact tourism, as the Caribbean knows quite well, and Mexico, of course. Then you have political instability, outbreaks, or security on tourism. So we analyze every single one to try to learn from the past. We believe it's very important to avoid the same mistakes from the past and to learn from the past experience. And let me share with you 3 lessons learned that we believe are very relevant nowadays. And hopefully those would help us to recover and move forward. The first one is 9/11. What happened after 9/11? That was one of the worst crises ever for travel and tourism, as you remember. Unfortunately, it took us 4 years and a half to recover. Why did it take us that long? Well, the reason was because the countries were not working in coordination with the private sector. And one of the reasons, because there were a couple, but one of the reasons that it took longer to recover the trust from the traveler, because we implemented protocols for safety in silos. Every country implemented their own. They didn't coordinate, they didn't share the same. And even almost 19 years later, when you were flying before COVID to the airports around the world, I'm sure that you will see different protocols. In some places they remove shoes, in some places they don't, in some places they remove the phone, in some places they don't. Even the plastic bag for liquids is a different size, for example, in Canada and in the UK. Now this is years after we have come a long way, but imagine at the beginning, when people were going to the screening in airports, the experience was very uncomfortable, and that impacted significantly to rebuild the trust. So we need to have global protocols standard throughout the world. That is the lesson learned in order to rebuild trust from the traveler. Lesson number 2, 2008. This was the worst crisis before COVID. COVID is 5 times the impact of 2008. Perhaps it's going to be a little bit more, unfortunately. But in the case of 2008, something that we learned is that we recovered in average. Again, some countries faster, some countries less. But in average, we recovered in 18 months in travel and tourism. Why was that? Because we had a coordinated approach. The G20 was created. Public and private collaboration was crucial. And we knew exactly what was going to happen. Ministers of finance worked very well with the private sector, and everyone knew exactly what was going to happen, and we moved faster out of that crisis. So that coordinated approach is key. And last lesson learned is that SARS, MERS, Ebola, they were very important outbreaks, and we were able to travel without a vaccine. Why we were able to travel? Because we were able to isolate the people infected. Now, COVID is different, yes, because 80% are asymptomatic. But we need to figure out how can we travel without being impacted. And that's what testing, contact tracing is key. So if we move to the next slide, basically, these are the 4 protocols, or the 4, principles that we define that are crucial for the recovery. I had the chance to speak in the G20 for travel and tourism recently in a virtual session that we had back in April. And this, every time that I have a chance to talk to governments, to talk to the industry, I made a point about these are the 4 principles for the path for recovery. The first one, as I say, the coordinated approach is key to reestablish effective operations. When is the right time? When is the right time to reopen borders? Very important to remove barriers. You will see that some countries are opening to other countries, and then we have some others that are creating what is called like bubbles, like kind of what you see in Australia and New Zealand, where the medical component is important because they both were able to contain the spread. The tourism component is important because of the movement of people. And then the political is important. The worst thing that we can have is to reopen and not know who's opening, and also having travel advisories, having, for instance, quarantines and barriers. That creates confusion and is impacting the recovery. And the number of jobs, as I say, can be doubled. From 121, it can go all the way, as I mentioned before, to 197. So the roles that you all play is very important to help us in this coordinated approach. Second point is the seamless traveler journey, what we call the seamless traveler journey. Every time that you travel to airports, that's what is called a seamless traveler journey. Hopefully it's without hassle. We believe that there are two phases: before the vaccine and after the vaccine. Once the vaccine is available, it's going to be easier because we will have just only to be able to record that you already have the vaccine and travel, have something similar to before COVID, hopefully. But if we don't have that vaccine, it's going to be complicated. But we cannot afford to travel because millions of people depend on this important economic activity. However, we believe that if through the experience for international travel, we include the component of testing, contact tracing, that's a good solution. If today you fly to Iceland, you have to they perform a test on arrival. If you're negative, then you can move around the country, but they give you an app, or they ask you to download an app where they trace and where you have been or where are you going to be in the next 2 weeks. So the contact tracing is so key, so that in 2 weeks you test positive, they know the possible people that have been impacted. That is crucial. Testing, contact tracing, we believe is very important according to WHO and multiple experts. The third one is the protocols. To what I say, the experience from 9/11, we believe this is key. And that's why we took the responsibility from the private sector to define those protocols. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we have done. And the last one, of course, is to continue with the support from governments. We at WTTC engage with more than 150 governments. We talk to all of them. We help to share experience. And we have been talking about the importance of protecting the workers, the importance of protecting the organizations, because as our friends from the travel community in Latin America will tell you, they have no income and they only have the expenses. And you cannot survive without an income and just the expenses. So we need to work together and continue with that support in order for them to survive. And then, of course, the promotion. In the next slide, we have more information about the paths. How do we see this recovery? It starts domestic, regional, and then international. Domestic, for instance, China has recovered already. 80% of the domestic traveling has been restored in China. That's wonderful news. We are seeing some recovery here in Europe. Germans traveling within Germany or French traveling within France is been moving in the right direction. Regional, however, for instance, is between Canada and Latin America, could be, or to Mexico, or US to Mexico, or the Caribbean as an example. Regional is what happened between Australia and New Zealand. Are these corridors, these bubbles or green zones that they are called? But in the case of the EU, regional is within the EU, from Germany to Spain, or Spain, Portugal, that's regional. And that's what we're seeing in the case of Europe in this summertime, some movement already and some reservations that they are very encouraging, and it will help us to recover. And then in the third phase, we're seeing international. International is long haul. It's between America and Asia, or between Europe and America. For instance, these flights that are very long haul, that's what we call international. So this is the three phases that we see. In the next slide, I believe we have the protocols. Yes. What happened with the protocols? As I say, we learned the lesson in a hard way after 9/11, and we want to make sure that we don't make the same mistake. So we work very closely with WHO, with CDC, and our members. And as you will see here, most of the hotel organizations and big chains are our members. I would say all of them probably. We got together, we shared the expertise. Our hotels have been, for instance, offering rooms to doctors and nurses during this situation, during COVID, in New York, in Spain, in Italy, and we're able to maintain those premises COVID-free. How is that possible? Because they implemented some protocols. So that knowledge and that expertise was included in the protocols that we defined. So here the private sector got together to create some protocols in order to rebuild trust from the traveler. The main goal is to rebuild trust. So next time that you go to a hotel, you will have exactly the same experience. If they ask you to wear a mask, for instance, during the check-in, all of them will ask you the same. If they tell you that there are no buffets because you cannot touch the food, all of them will be the same. So we started with hospitality. Then we went to outdoor shopping. So far, we have 9 different protocols, and they are verticals. They are per industry. So we have for airlines, for airports, for MICE, for instance, and each one, or attractions, each one is very relevant according to the industry. Then we say, okay, how the travelers are going to know that we have implemented the protocols. So our members and us created something that we call the Safe Travel Stamp. And this is just a stamp that pretty much is saying your protocols are at the level of the global private sector, the standard that we define to rebuild trust for the travelers, and what we need and what we have done based in our experience. And that stamp was supposed to be only domestic, but the reality is that we had some countries asking us for this stamp. And I have to tell you, at the very beginning, we say no, but later we say, well, why not if we can share the experience? So we gave this stamp to 5 destinations. If we move to the next, please. For instance, Portugal was one of the first destinations that they were way ahead of the game, and they implemented their protocols, and the protocols are exactly the same that ours, very aligned according to WHO, CDC, so we gave them the stamp. Quintana Roo in Mexico was another destination where Cancun is, that they are very ahead of the game because they had a lot of experience from past outbreaks in the case of H1N1, and we also gave them the stamp. Saudi Arabia, another country also that acquired the stamp. And by the way, UNWTO fully endorsed our stamp because the goal at the end of the day is to rebuild the trust from the traveler. So far, we have more than 45, I think is the last number as of yesterday, destinations or countries that have been granted the stamp, all the way from Kenya that we have in the case of Africa, or we have in Europe, as I say, several. As you can see here, these are just some of the logos of the destinations that have received the stamp. But it's very important to say this is not a certification. This is just assessing their protocols. We have evaluated the protocols, and they are at the same level than the private sector. But when we give the country the stamp, for instance, in the case of Egypt, it is Egypt's responsibility to make sure that whenever they share the stamp with their local suppliers or the local travel sector, they need to make sure that they implement the same protocols. I don't need to monitor our members. They have done it. They have implemented the protocols, but the countries can help us with the SMEs and the rest of the industry. And I think this is something that is going to help. We have more than 100 destinations in the pipeline asking us for the stamp, and we're trying to process as much as we can. But what's interesting is that everyone is eager to rebuild their trust from the traveler. That is so important. If we move to the next slide, please. Basically, this is what I have. I wanted to thank you, and now stop right here and open for questions. We have a lot of information. As I say, I didn't want to bombard you with the statistics and data. I mentioned that 10% of the global GDP is the average. That number is equivalent to 8% in the case of Canada. And in the case of Latin America, it's a similar number, 8%. And Mexico is around 15%. Very important in our data, we consider direct and indirect. If we consider both, not only the bill that you pay to the hotel is important, but also, for instance, the fruit that is purchased for the breakfast is also important. And I'll stop right here, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. We were expecting something like this. For us, it's very important to hear and to listen from a person like you that it's very well related with the issue. And of course, as you mentioned, for not only for Canada, for our countries too, the tourism, it's an industry very, very important. You just mentioned what is the GDP and how affects the GDP in our countries. We were listening that in Mexico it's 16%, but in all our countries, the tourism industry and all the services related are very important. And as we see that the industry begins to get ready and to be prepared to the new normality that we hope it comes as soon as possible, in that case, are good news to at least listen that the companies and the industries getting ready to. And with this, I would like to offer the word to Juan Jose Gomez Camacho, the ambassador of Mexico, who has a question for you. And I encourage all the rest of my colleagues and the audience to take this opportunity and to speak with Gloria, because I think it's very important to listen from her. She represents an industry that it's so important for our country. So this is the moment that we can talk with her. Juan Jose, please, por favor.
Alejandro, muchas gracias. Gloria, what a pleasure to have you here, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Your presentation, absolutely fascinating. I could spend an hour just asking you questions, but I limit myself to a couple of them. Number one, well, the numbers look both gigantic in terms of the value of tourism globally. I have to confess, I didn't realize how big it was, but also they look terribly grim as a consequence of COVID-19. So my two questions are, in the recovery, and clearly you are very optimistic, in the recovery, do you have an impression on which segments of the tourism industry should be coming back easier and faster? For example, business tourism vis-a-vis sun and beach, or urban tourism. I don't know how to classify it, cultural tourism, etc., etc. So which of these you think could start and pick up earlier than the other ones, or easier? And second, I don't know if you have some information on this. I assume that many actors, players in the industry may go out of business forever or for a long time. This might be the case probably of the airline industry. You see many airlines which are not only struggling now, but they were very weak before because it's a difficult business. Hotels, I don't know. Big chains, I suppose they can make it, but I'm not so sure smaller hotels or smaller players. So the question is, do you have an idea of how many could simply go out of business permanently, and how the tourism industry can pick up without these players, if my question makes any sense to you? And thanks again, Gloria, for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you, Juan Jose. Let me answer the first one, right? And it has to do with the segments that they will recover faster. We believe first is going to be leisure, right? People are eager to take a break, especially in the countries that after a lockdown. Here in the UK has been 15, 16 weeks, and people are eager to book. For instance, as an example, we're seeing a lot of bookings also within Europe. So leisure is first, then of course is business, and then we were thinking that it was going to be Congress and conventions. However, in China, something happened that we had leisure and then Congress and conventions at the same time, the business, okay? Because they implemented the right protocols. Now, in Asia, we also are seeing actually something that is called staycations. I don't know, staycations, you have heard about the concept. Is people checking out in their homes and checking in the hotel in the same city. That's pretty strange, but we have seen that a lot in Asia. So people would leave their house and go to a hotel, I guess, to get pampered or just enjoy experience within the same city. So we have seen a lot of staycations in Asia, leisure, and as remembered, Asia was first impacted by COVID, then came to Europe, then of course went to America, and then the rest, right? This was in waves. So in the case of Asia, staycations, holidays, families, and then business. In Europe is going a similar path, but we haven't seen that many staycations, okay? In the case of Europe, it's more like holidays and for leisure. Now, in terms of segments, that's interesting as well, because we have seen a lot of sun and beach requests, a lot, I guess because it's summer, a lot of adventure, outdoors, a lot of culture, and also less for crowded places. However, when you look at what's going on, the Eiffel Tower opened this week, for instance, or it was last week actually, and they have a system to book online. I mean, it was sold out already. So we were thinking that places where usually were crowds in the past, we're going to have less requests, but it seems that that is not the case, that most of the people, I mean, are willing, they want to travel, but we see a big trend for sun and beach, culture, and adventure in a way. Those are the segments that we're seeing more. Now, to your point about the industry, unfortunately, not every country and every region is going to recover at the same time or within the same time frame. And why is that? 3 reasons. The first one is that the governments that supported more their sector are going to recover faster. Why? Because the governments that had incentives and programs to protect, for instance, the SMEs and the workers, they're going to have a business community that is going to help them to recover. The countries that are not receiving the same support from the governments, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of, especially SMEs, closing or going out of business because they don't have the cash or the liquidity to survive. So that is a fact. The second one that we're seeing is that either big players or small players, every country is doing something different. But we have smaller countries like in Central America or the Caribbean, or we have big countries in Europe, or for instance, sort of incentives to survive in terms of loans without interest, in terms of paying for the workers. Like here in the UK, the government offered a system or mechanism that is called furlough, that you put a contract in pause and the government pays you for 80% of the salary of that worker, and there's a cap. But you don't have to lay off the workers of the hotels or the restaurants, just put their contracts on hold. Same situation in Italy and France, they pay for 100%. In some other countries, 60%. So we have seen all these schemes, but the reality is very complicated now to know who's going to survive. I can tell you, we are all in survival mode. Unfortunately, still nothing is guaranteed. The companies that they were doing bad before COVID, they are already out of business, most of them. There was an airline here in the US that closed 2 weeks after the outbreak hit the UK. So we have seen that a lot. What's really sad is the lack, in some cases, of support from some governments to big companies. And if an airline goes down, it's not just the employees of the airline. It's the entire ecosystem impacted and hundreds of thousands of SMEs, right? If an airline does not survive, the travel agencies are impacted, the tour operators are impacted, the hotel is impacted, everyone is impacted, because in this ecosystem, we are very connected. And that's something that unfortunately some governments have not anticipated, have not seen. And I have to say, there are some others that they have measured and they are doing as much as they can to step up and help.
Okay, thank you, Gloria, for this information. And I will, before I hand over to Ambassador of Cuba, Josefina Vidal, who also has a question, I would like to recognize that I can see around the screen that the Assistant Deputy Minister and good friend of all our countries, Michael Grant, is connected. Big hug to Michael, and happy Canada Day, the 2nd of July, but it's the same. We really love your country, Michael, and we thank you for all your support. I can see also Patricia Peña, she's the ambassador of Canada to Chile. Thank you for joining us, Patricia. Josefina, please.
Yes, thank you. Gloria, thank you so much for your very comprehensive presentation. You raised one of the points which is a source of concern to us. As some Latin American and Caribbean countries have restarted to reopen some tourism operations, we are seeing some factors that might impact our recovery. One of them, you mentioned it, is that each country is doing things its own way. So it's difficult, you know, to have a standardized, let's say, approach, because in some countries there are still restrictions or quarantines or travel alerts and so on. But there is another factor that we, as the best of our knowledge, the majority of insurance companies do not want to accept to grant insurance against COVID-19. And this is, in our view, another factor that might affect the recovery of travel between countries. Do you have an idea about how international tourism organizations as the one you work for can influence to have a greater commitment from insurance companies to accept to cover some travel? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I work quite well in the past with Minister Marrero from your country, and I'm very aware about the efforts that you have done. In terms of insurance, well, let me just tell you two things. I understand that while closing the borders, every country look at their own citizens and try to protect them, and it was very difficult. I mean, I don't blame them. I cannot imagine how difficult it is to make decisions based on little data and little that we know about this virus, right? So everyone closed their borders pretty fast. I think what we have seen is that coordination with the private sector is crucial, is very important. And we have seen some measures that without even thinking had some important repercussions. For instance, when you close the borders even to your own nationals in some countries, and I'm not referring to yours, but I have seen that in others, it's very complicated, right? For us to repatriation efforts and all of that. And I would encourage, because the role that you will play is so important, because you're a great voice for your countries, to have those bridges with the private sector and help us so that at least the reopen can be done in a coordinated way. And we're saying when they are ready. There are some countries, yes, that they have done a better job containing the spread, and those might be ready to connect with other countries, as my example of Australia and New Zealand, for instance. There are some cases here in Europe very similar to that. Now, that being said, and we're more than happy to share any data in that case, because there are three components: the medical, the tourism, and of course the political. In the case of insurance, yes, we had a situation. We were aware about the issues with the insurance. Of course, the insurance companies had a difficult time with COVID, and some of them even went out of business. Our members, we have a lot of insurance companies as we represent the entire ecosystem. AIG, Aon, and Ingle Group, all of them are our members. And we just had a meeting with them recently, actually it was 2 weeks ago, to talk about that. And yes, there are products to cover for COVID. They have defined products to cover for COVID. So if you want to purchase insurance to fly or for a specific trip, today you find solutions. What right now is a little bit more complicated is for the business travelers worldwide, because every country has different risks and is different assessments right now. But those products can be built. There is a Canadian company, actually very successful. One of our members, Robin Ingle, is the contact that's his specialty. He works with insurers and insurance companies to provide products for travel. So the solution is there. But the other thing that is very important, and perhaps you can help us as well, while the countries start reopening, when there are travel bans or travel alerts for specific countries, in those cases, the insurance does not apply. And that's why the business traveler is the first one to cancel. Congress and conventions are canceled. And in some cases, leisure travelers, because of the travel alert. So if my country is issuing a travel alert to another country, and I want to travel to another country, my country is telling me, but I don't guarantee that something happens to you there, I'll bring you back, right? And that's when the insurance struggles. So, and those travel alerts are defined by the local consulates or the local ambassadors providing that information back to their countries. And that's where you all play a very important role. And I know that from my own governmental experience, in my relationships with some governments and some ambassadors in my own country, making sure that they had my data, they had the information, and we were very transparent and shared everything with them. And they became our best allies. So in that case, we need to make sure that we remove travel bans at the same time that we reopen, so that the insurance can be available as well.
Thank you so much, Gloria. We have some more questions. Those are from the public, from the audience, and we have one. it's made from Arturo Hernandez. Has the WTO detected an increase of COVID-19 cases in domestic travels in countries in Europe or in China? And also, is the World Travel Organization working in close daily cooperation with the WHO in tracing COVID-19 cases?
I think, I'm not sure if the question is referring to WTO, the World Tourism Organization, or the World Trade Organization, or us, WTTC, but I will take it that that's for us.
No, WTTC.
WTTC, okay. No, because the World Tourism Organization is also conducting a lot of efforts, right? And we work with them quite well because they represent, of course, the governments. In the case of domestic, okay, based on the lessons learned from the past, we need two components. One component is to make sure that we have the right protocols. We spoke to, for instance, the School of Public Health in Harvard, where we have a relationship with them. And they shared with me something interesting. They say, if you need to take public transportation or any sort of transportation, and if you wear a mask, you reduce the risk of getting the virus or spreading the virus between 82 to 92%. And on top of that, if you clean your hands with sanitizers, another 5%. And then on top of that, if you can do social distancing, it's another 3%. Now, if you cannot do social distancing, right there, you see 90% to 95% reduction of the risk. So we need to follow the protocols, and the protocols is something that we all are responsible. You're going to get in a plane, everyone should wear a mask, at least until we have a vaccine. And if everyone wears a mask, we reduce, as it has been said by a lot of experts, very significant the spread of the virus. So the combination between implementing the protocols and the testing contact tracing, which I mentioned before, has allowed not one, multiple countries to recover in domestic. One example is China. Another example that we saw is South Korea. Despite that they had one situation in a bar, the rest is okay. Iceland, if you look at the example of Iceland, it's very interesting. Yes, it's an island, but they haven't had a lockdown. They never had a lockdown in the case of Iceland, but they had protocols in place. They were wearing masks, social distancing, and they had a lot of testing contact tracing. Germany, a lot of Germans moving within Germany, and for domestic has not been an increase. The situation that they had in Germany, it was isolated and it was a meat processing plant, but not because of travel. So yes, this is not a sum zero game, either health or travel. You can have both, and we have the data, we have seen that, as long as you follow the rules and the protocols and the contact tracing and testing, of course.
Okay, Gloria, and our audience, it's very active. Dulce Maria Valles and Jose Telich, they're making some question. When does the WTTC expect to recover and return to the regular flow and number of tourists the world had by the end of 2019? And Dulce Maria, she would like to ask first, she thanks for the excellent presentation. And as she mentioned that the COVID-19 is a real challenge, if you consider that the way of traveling should be reconsidered. I know you have been going through this, but maybe short answer for them. They had the
Yeah. That is good. Thank you, Ambassador. The first one is, that's the crystal ball. Nobody knows when are we going to be recovering. If I knew that question, probably I would be a millionaire by now. But the reality is that when we look at the past, and we like to analyze the past experiences, the first outbreaks, it took us 35 months to recover. The last, it took us 10. Yes, those were regional outbreaks. We have never seen something like a pandemic, kind of what we're living right now, which has a lot of challenges, but also some opportunities, because we all are in this together towards the same goal, right? The issue is going to be how well we follow these 4 principles that we lay out, and how well is the coordination public and private, okay? In Europe, we have made a lot of progress. I can tell you that at the very beginning, they were talking about corridors between Germany and Austria. They were talking about just allowing some countries within the EU to visit to each other. Finally, we talked to them, everyone talked to them, and they did a great job, and they opened at the same time within the EU, because they were at the same level, right? Within 3 weeks of difference, but they opened. So, and that has helped a lot. Now, we are not seeing that in other regions. We are working very closely with Saudi Arabia, who's the chair for the G20, to help us in this coordinated effort. We see the recovery that is going to happen, as I say, first domestic, regional, and then international. This summer is going to be key. We are seeing two things. In Europe, things are going really well. In the US, we would hope that they would go better because the protocols, unfortunately, as we have seen, they open and we have some issues there. In Latin America, is going to be interesting to see because the south of Latin America is in winter. This is not perhaps the high season, but whenever the high season for the summer comes, it's very important to do this in a coordinated way, send that right message, and talk to the private sector. Because if you open, as an example, one country, and I'm making this up because I have no clue, but if Chile decides to open and doesn't coordinate that with Argentina and does not coordinate that with the private sector, tourism is not going to happen, right? And even if they announce it, you need to prepare, you need to be ready. So that coordination is key, and especially because the movement of people between Chile and Argentina, we know is significant, right? Especially during some times of the year. It's the same situation, Dominican Republic and the US or Mexico and other countries. That coordination, very important, and they need to let us know. The UK, as an example, has some quarantines. Those quarantines, in our view, should have been imposed during the lockdown, not during the reopen. Now they are reconsidering, but they are not communicating when are they going to reopen yet. And they are not working with the private sector yet in that reopening coordination. And it has been very complicated, which unfortunately has impacted them significantly. We just released the day before yesterday, I think it was, last year, the top 10 cities that people book in the summer in Europe. The number one was London. This year so far, London fall to the number 10. Why? Because people don't want to fly to London and be in a quarantine for 2 weeks, right? And this uncertainty is killing the sector, okay? Hopefully I answered both questions.
Gloria, I know you're short of time, but there's 2 more questions. If you're
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. I have 5 more minutes, yes.
Okay, great. What are the chances of a new investor to pick up the business of bankrupt companies in the travel businesses? Will people make up for lost time in travel? That's one. And the other one, besides solution, global alignment, standardization of measures, confidence recovery and transparency, is it possible to have economic trip incentives different than subsidies for the tourism industry, for users worldwide, and in some cases, stimulus checks to travel to certain regions? They're not easy questions.
Yeah, the second one is happening already. The Italian government, and I'm sure that you can get more information from the ambassador of Italy, can share with you. It's not the only one. There are a couple of others. The Italian government is offering vouchers to the Italians to travel within Italy to incentivize the economy. That's interesting. I think the German government is offering the same. So some countries are already offering incentives for people to move, because as long as you start moving and get the engine of the economy moving, you will recover faster, right? So that's what we have seen, not only in Italy and Germany and some countries also in Asia, we have seen that. The second one is with investments. If there's a time to invest, now is the time. And we are seeing a lot of investments in the private sector, companies buying other companies. One of our private equity members, for instance, bought a piece of TripAdvisor, $300 million investment. There's a lot of money out there and a lot of investment is happening because they know that we will recover. For sure, we will recover. We have recovered in the last 90 crisis and we will recover. And the reason is because people love to travel. That's part of our nature. And we enjoy that as one of the top 3 things that the human being enjoys the most. So we will recover. The question is, how long is that going to take? The other thing has to do with investments. Now is the time for governments to invest in infrastructure, in projects related to tourism. Now is not the time to save money. The interests are very low. Now is the chance for governments to look for the IDBs, of the world, the development banks and other different players to look for funding to invest in projects. Because if you get these projects investing in infrastructure in your country, projects related to tourism, then you will be able to recover faster. We have seen that as own experience. I had the chance to see that in my own country when we invested after H1N1, the security, and of course the impact of the financial crisis in the US. There was a huge investment in infrastructure, and we were able to recover in less than 12 months. And it was pretty good. And I have seen that also going on in some other countries. Here in Europe, look what the EU is doing. They have assigned $6 billion for projects, for investment in infrastructures. They know that quite well. So now is the time for countries to think, okay, is priority tourism for your country? Are the jobs a priority? Because this is a sector that is not outsourced, not offshore, creates a lot of jobs, has a lot of mobility, 50% women, 30% youth, very inclusive, reduced poverty, so increased education. What else can a head of a state ask, right? And I have to say, the only positive thing of this COVID is that finally, most of the governments of the world have realized about the importance of tourism because of the domino effect and the impact that has had in their countries.
Gloria, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation, and the question and answers were very dynamic. We really appreciate your time, and you can be sure that we will invite you again when we see that the industry is recovering, so you will show us figures that are absolutely different from the one that we're seeing.